What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. As always, I'm your host, Sydney Jones. And coming up on today's episode, the 2024 Denver Broncos schedule has been released. We'll break it down week by week coming up. The wait is finally over. The Denver Broncos 2024 schedule is out. So let's take a look. The Broncos will open up their season on the road in Seattle to face the Seahawks at Lumen Field. Week 2 will be their home opener versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. In Week 3, they head down to Tampa Bay to face the Buccaneers. Week 4, they're back on the East Coast again to face the New York Jets. Their first AFC West showdown comes in Week 5 as they host the Las Vegas Raiders. The Broncos also host the Los Angeles Chargers in Week 6. Broncos' first primetime matchup comes in Week 7 as they head down to New Orleans to face the Saints. In Week 8, they return home to face the Carolina Panthers. Then the Broncos are back on the road in Week 9 as they face the Baltimore Ravens. The Broncos' first divisional road game comes in Week 10 at Kansas City. Week 11, the Broncos are back at Empower Field at Mile High as they host the Atlanta Falcons. Then in Week 12, the Broncos head to Las Vegas to take on the Raiders. And in Week 13, the Broncos are back in prime time at Empower Field at Mile High as they host the Cleveland Browns. The Broncos' bye week falls on Week 14 this year, and then they're back at home for Week 15 as they host the Indianapolis Colts. The Broncos then hit the road for a 2-game road stretch as they head to Los Angeles to face the Chargers. And then in Week 17, they fly out to Cincinnati to face the Bengals. And then finally, the Broncos end the regular season back at Empower Field at Mile High as they host the Kansas City Chiefs. Now joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio is Broncos lead writer Eric Delala. Eric, we just took a look at the 2024 schedule. It's an exciting time of year. I know it's your favorite time of year.
I love this time of year. So it's like Christmas.
It is. Initial thoughts?
I think it's good. I think, it's interesting the way it sets up and that you start with 3 of 4 on the road, then 3 of 4 at home, and then another stretch of 3 of 4 on the road. It's just kind of a little bit unusual in that way. Obviously, a really late bye week.
Yeah.
The latest bye week since 2001 for the Broncos, all the way in Week 14. So that's going to be a long stretch there.
Very long.
For the team, certainly for us to start the season there.
I always look where the bye week is to start.
Exactly.
That's the first thing I look at.
And it's a little bit late this year.
Yes, it is.
And then just, it also, of course, stands out opening on the road against Seattle. A lot of speculation. Would it be the Jets? Would it be the Steelers? Would it be the Chargers? And it kind of ends up being a team that I don't think a lot of people predicted. And now for the second time in 3 years, the Broncos will head to Seattle to open the season. I do think there's a lot of good things here in terms of how this team can maybe get going a little bit early in the year and how it sets up a little bit nicely in that regard. But obviously a lot of division opponents late in the year and the year at home against Kansas City. And then that primetime game against Cleveland also stands out in addition to the road primetime game in New Orleans as Sean Payton makes his return there. So some little nuggets throughout, but I think what stands out is just kind of that uniqueness of 3 of 4 on the road, 3 of 4 at home, 3 of 4 on the road. Going to be maybe road warriors a little bit at times for this Broncos team. It'll be interesting to see how they respond.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't notice that, Eric, when I looked at it. You mentioned some of the primetime games there. There's 2 of them. Thursday Night Football in New Orleans for Week 7, and then a Week 13 Monday Night Football matchup at home versus the Browns. No Sunday Night Football game this year.
Yeah, and I think this is a team that Sean Payton has said it before. You play well, you play in prime time, and the Broncos, they've got to prove themselves, I think, this year. Obviously, externally, the expectations aren't super high, but you go out and prove that you're a good football team early in the year. Maybe you get flexed into a game or 2 later on. Obviously, the flex rules are a lot different now.
Good point.
Can flex Thursday night, can flex Monday night, Sunday night. So I don't know, maybe you play well enough and you look at a Week 10 game at Kansas City, or you look at a game late in the year against the Chargers or Cincinnati. I mean, you play well, maybe you end up in one of those standalone windows. You got to go out there and prove it, though. And I do think I like that the New Orleans game is in prime time.
Yeah, me too.
It's
that'll be a fun one.
We'll see what Sean Payton says about going back to New Orleans.
Yeah.
I would imagine, like most coaches, kind of downplay what that means, even though we know how much New Orleans means to him. But
for sure,
it's a big game for a lot of people going back. A lot of people on the Broncos staff, a lot of people on the Broncos roster have ties to the Saints.
Yeah.
You look at people on the Saints still, a lot of guys there that Sean Payton drafted. a quarterback there in Derek Carr that the Broncos know well from his time with the Raiders. So that's kind of a compelling matchup even outside of the Sean Payton angle. But it'll be a fun one to have in prime time. And said, I think that's going to be your first time down at the Superdome.
Yes, it will.
It gets loud in there. I've only been there once. That was when Will Parks returned the 2-point the blocked extra point for a 2-point conversion. It was loud then. I would imagine it's going to be pretty wild there in October when Sean Payton makes his return.
Yeah. I have that one circled on my schedule here, Eric. That's going to be my favorite one of the season, I think. I haven't been to New Orleans and I haven't been to Cincinnati. I haven't been to Paycor Stadium either. So those are the two I'm
cross a couple off.
Yeah, crossing off my list. What about you?
Yeah, in terms of road trips, I think you look early in the year at that Jets game. That stands out to me. I think that'll just be a fun one. Obviously, the Broncos, a tough game against the Jets last year.
Right.
You hope that Aaron Rodgers is healthy and available for that game. And then kind of all the external stuff that goes with that matchup. Former head coach Nathaniel Hackett still there as offensive coordinator. That just stands out to me as one that could be intriguing. A couple other ones that catch my eye. I think at Seattle is just really intriguing because we don't know very much about what this football team is going to look like.
Definitely.
You know, from a Seattle standpoint in terms of they've got a new head coach in Mike McDonald after moving on from Pete Carroll.
Right.
And then from the Broncos perspective, we don't have any idea right now as we sit here about who's going to play quarterback. So is this going to be Jarrett Stidham, holding on to the starting quarterback job?
Right.
Is this going to be Zach Wilson, kind of a resurgence to the type of player people thought he could be coming out of BYU? Or is this going to be Bo Nix in his very first opportunity starting on the road in a hostile environment?
Yeah.
Obviously played at Oregon, so used to playing in Washington and those tough Pac-12 matchups. Whoever's out there, I think it's going to be really exciting just to see what does this team look like. And like we said, I think not a lot of people know what to think about the Broncos going into 2024 externally, just because, got rid of Justin Simmons, Russell Wilson was released, lost guys like Josie Jewell and Lloyd Cushenberry to free agency, and then brought in some really good guys, John Franklin Myers, added in free agency to the defensive line, brought in Josh Reynolds. I mean, there's been some moves here too, but we just don't know what it's all going to look like. And I think externally around the country, people are the same way in that, like, what is this team going to be when week one arrives? And so for me, I can't wait to see what this team looks like on September 8th. And so, on our website, we've got kind of this list of the most compelling games. For me, Sid, week one is right at the top just because of some of the unknowns that this team has going into the year.
Absolutely. Yeah, Eric, you touched on this a little bit, but to go more in depth, when you look at the schedule, what are some of the tough stretches that you see?
Yeah, I think three things stand out to me. One is just, again, the bye week is so late that week 1 through 13 is going to be a tough stretch just because it's going to be a grind. So you're going to get to week 9, week 10, week 11. It's going to feel like a little bit of a grind, I think, because of playing so many consecutive games. So that would be an area where, again, as a coaching staff, as a player-led team, you've got to find ways to just stay in it, hopefully ride some momentum at that point. That stands out to me. I think the other thing that stands out is just how many early starts the Broncos have. I mean, 1 p.m. at Tampa Bay, 1 p.m. at New York, 1 p.m. at Baltimore, 12 p.m. at Kansas City, 1 p.m. at Las Vegas. A little different, I think, on Pacific time compared to when you're going the other way. But that's something the Broncos are going to have to figure out because last year, and Sean Payton mentioned this at the end of the season, there were some issues when there were some kind of early kicks.
Games,
Houston, obviously, the Broncos got off to a slow start. And so it'll be interesting to see how do the Broncos look to combat that as we head toward the season. Do you go out a little bit early for certain games? Do you practice at different times? I don't know what the answer is, but that'll be something to watch. And I think just something that makes the schedule a little bit difficult. And then lastly, Sid, I think a specific stretch will be week 9 and 10 at Baltimore, at Kansas City. Obviously, the 2 AFC finalists last year. Assuming that, and again, we'll see what happens, but whoever the quarterback is, at that point, you'll have had some time to mesh with the offense. Hopefully, some of these young guys are able to come in and get comfortable. So it's nice that you don't play those teams, for example, week 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But that being said, that's going to be a defining stretch. What is that, 7 games into the year? I mean, if you're hovering around, or excuse me, 8 games into the year, even if you're hovering around 500, a little bit above 500, those 2 games are going to be critical in terms of staying in the playoff chase, being in the hunt, that sort of thing, and a chance to prove yourself against some really elite competition. So that stretch, week 9, week 10, buckle up. Those are going to be tough games.
Yeah, they certainly will. Eric, lastly here, how do you think about the strength of the schedule?
Yeah, I think I believe 6 games against playoff teams from last year. That Baltimore-Kansas City stretch, I believe, is the only time with back-to-back games against playoff opponents. So
that's good.
It sets up okay, I think, from that perspective. Again, you're going to play some good defenses early in the year in Seattle, Pittsburgh, Tampa, New York. I mean, those are all good defenses, so a challenge from that perspective, but all maybe some offenses that are maybe finding their way a little bit, or, what is Seattle going to look like under a new coaching staff, depending on, we haven't mentioned Russell Wilson and the home opener potentially coming back to Denver.
Right.
Could be Justin Fields. Either way, that, they're going to maybe be figuring things out in week 2. Tampa a little bit more consistent offensively, but then the Jets, Aaron Rodgers coming back. What does he look like as he returns? Yeah. So maybe a chance that you're getting some teams that are figuring things out. Is there a way for the Broncos to start a little bit fast? Obviously, a tough start last year. You got to find a way to start a little bit faster. I like having the first 2 division games at home. Got to get off this skid to Las Vegas here. Yep. I mean, the Chiefs one is gone, and hopefully you find a way to keep some momentum going against them. But you got to get rid of this. You can't be competitive in the division if you're losing to Las Vegas every single time. So I do like the fact that you've got some division games there early in the year at home, get a chance to maybe build some positive momentum. It'll be emotional in New Orleans, but I think a game that the Broncos, I think compare favorably. A young guy in Bryce Young that's going to look to take a step forward in Carolina. We talked about Baltimore, Kansas City. You've got a stretch there, Atlanta, at Vegas, Cleveland, where maybe you can find a way to have some success with some home games. Right. Same way, a young quarterback in Indianapolis. I think it sets up okay for the Broncos. There's not like that one stretch where, hey, for 3 or 4 weeks, this just looks brutal. Or there's no 3-game road trip. There's, the big thing, of course, is you only have back-to-back home games once, and the bye is so late. But other than that, there's no stretch where I just say, oh, man, how are they going to get through that? And so that's a good thing for the Broncos, I think. And so we'll just kind of have to see how it plays out.
I know. A lot of unknowns, like you said, going into this one, but all exciting nonetheless.
Yeah, and we get Jim Harbaugh, Sean Payton. That's true. Potentially an Oregon matchup between Bo Nix and Justin Herbert if Bo's playing by then. So a lot of good storylines, but
sure. As always.
We'll see if they can earn another primetime game here later in the season.
Fingers crossed. Well, Eric, appreciate your time.
You got it, Sid.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of Broncos Now. Broncos Country, thanks so much for tuning in. I'll meet you right back here on the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube next week for another episode. I will see you all then.